Hello, my name is Sam Edgerton. I'm an undergraduate at the University of St. Thomas studying environmental studies and political science. This presentation will be looking at conservation effectiveness and where conservation efforts and politics intersect. When we're talking about public lands, it's important to identify what's at stake here. America's total public lands amount in size to over 3 times the area of the entire country of France. National monuments are a key aspect of this discussion. These large patches of protected lands established by the executive branch through the Antiquities Act have become a focus of discussion in today's news. Since public lands are so vast, the quality of the environment within them is essential to discuss. Protecting lands has direct effect on the biodiversity of these areas. How humans affect these areas is a vital factor to keep in mind. Along the same line, it is also important to identify how these public lands affect people and communities that live near them as well. We will look at how the western half of the United States is undergoing a cultural shift from Old West to New West, and how this shift affects populations of people living in this region. First, it's important to address that there are undeniable benefits that come along with preserving wilderness areas. According to a report done by the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, protected lands lead to improvements in air quality by removing ozone, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxide from the air. Protecting wilderness also leads to more biodiversity, which in turn helps ecosystems become more resilient to the effects of climate change. Where there is protected land, there is often less roadways and pavement, meaning that natural flood regulation is increased as the ground is more apt to absorb excess stormwater. Focusing in on the biodiversity element of this topic, the biodiversity that comes along with protected areas allows for a wide field of species that humans can benefit from. For example, this could mean more options for potential medicines to treat certain diseases. Having a healthy ecosystem also leads to effective ecosystem services, or benefits provided by ecosystems when they are able to fulfill their natural role, such as storm buffering, which can economically benefit communities of people that live in areas at risk of flooding and erosion. Again, bringing this back to climate change, as extreme weather events become more frequent, having effective ecosystem services will help soften the damages of our changing climate. David Theobald set out to study the ecological integrity of ecosystems and how human interference plays a role in his journal article published in Landscape Ecology. The map displayed here shows the levels of human interference across the entire continental US. We will look at this layer more closely later on. Theobald calculated degrees of human modification of landscapes by sectioning off areas into ecological indicators. This table shows the categories he classified: undeveloped, residential, mixed-use developed, agriculture, resource extraction, industrial, recreational, transportation, and unknown. Industrialized areas are areas of high human impact. These would be regions such as urban centers. The ranking goes all the way down to least affected by humans, which is undeveloped at 0. Ecosystems with high ecological integrity contain diverse organisms that maintain natural functions and compositions within the system. In addition, minimal human interference in an ecosystem leads to higher integrity. We will be looking into 3 aspects of protected lands during this presentation. First, we will look at the connection between the degree of protection and the amount of human modification for public lands. Next, we will take a closer look at the political debate surrounding the proposed revoking of status of national monuments and determine if the political climate in areas the monuments reside plays a role. Finally, we will address cultural and economic effects of living near protected public lands. This map displays the total amount of land in the continental US that is public or owned by the federal government. As you can see, an overwhelming amount of this lies in the West. That is why this presentation will be focused on the western half of the United States. This is a map from the Protected Areas database of the USGS, and it displays all of those public lands classified into 4 quantiles, or gaps, depending on their level of protection. National parks, for example, would be gap status 1, seen in dark green, where less protected areas, such as military bases or Native American reservations, would be status 4, seen in red. Gap status 2 and 3 represent variations in protection and regulation of public lands, such as areas where hunting and fishing is allowed. This is the Theobald layer that displays the amount of human modification across the entire continental U.S. landscape. As you can see, urban areas are the most modified by humans. They are displayed in purple. The middle of the U.S. is also considerably modified by agriculture, as Theobald showed in his study. These areas have an ecological indicator of 0.5, which is considerable. The West is much greener, indicating that it is less modified than the East. Taking the human modification layer and running it through the zonal statistics tool with the protected areas database map from earlier, I am able to display the human modification inside of public lands. From dark green to red, this layer shows what public lands have been the most modified by human activity. Areas in green are least modified, and areas in red are the most modified. So what does this mean? We can now determine if the level of protection has any influence on the amount of human modification a public land experiences. I took the average human modification for each of the 4 quantiles and organized the data in a graph that better displays this correlation. As this chart indicates, there is a clear correlation between the level of protection for public lands and the amount of human modification that they experience. The difference between gap status 1 and 4 is extensive, with gap 1 protected lands seeing just over 2% modification and gap 4 lands seeing almost 10% modification. More protection does in fact mean less human modification. There is a cultural divide in the West between Old West communities and New West communities. Old West communities are based in traditional industries of the West, such as mining and ranching, where New West communities are based in newer tourism and recreational industries. To help you picture this, think of an old farm town as an Old West community and a ski resort town as a New West community. This cultural shift has resulted in issues among populations of the West who disagree with how their natural resources are best used. Debate in the West over how public land should be used is not new. However, it has recently become a hot-button topic. Much of the West is dedicated to federally controlled lands. Some residents believe this control should be given back to the local communities. As stated earlier, not all public lands are protected as strictly as national parks. Many are open to hunting, fishing, and extractive activities. This is a factor that will become important while talking about the political climate around public lands. This map depicts the national monuments that the current administration has looked into reducing. Only 3 on this map have officially been reduced. Some have had no changes made, and the majority are still under review. This controversy has centered on monuments throughout the West, but none have seen as much media attention as those being recommended for downsizing in Utah. Donald Trump, along with Secretary of the Interior Ryan Zinke, have taken a leading role in reducing the size of monuments such as Bears Ears and the Grand Staircase Escalante. In examining some claims in support of reducing the size of these monuments, the Old West versus New West clash can be identified. Trump will refer to these lands as federal lands and not public lands. This is on purpose. In doing this, he is able to frame them as areas snatched by the federal government from local residents, as opposed to public lands owned by everybody. Appealing to the Old West industries, such as mining and ranching, has also been an effective way to gain the support for this effort. This is not to say that Old West and New West mentalities cannot find common ground in this debate. Prominent Utah Representative Jason Chaffetz recently withdrew a proposed bill that sought to sell off immense stretches of public land in Utah. Pressure from his constituents forced him to pull back on his support for this bill. However, those pushing for Chaffetz to change his mind were not necessarily passionate New West environmentalists, but conservative hunters and fishermen from Utah, which coincides more with the Old West mentality. This instance is a promising example of how Old West and New West communities can work together to fight for the protection of public lands. Where this conversation becomes even more interesting is when you examine the political climate of the areas housing some of the monuments that have been resilient to reductions versus monuments that have been reduced. These maps display the voting data from both the 2012 presidential election and the 2016 presidential election. Counties in blue voted Democrat, where counties in red voted Republican. Craters of the Moon National Monument, which withstood threats of downsizing, lies in one of the only blue counties of Idaho, Blaine County, which houses Sun Valley, a traditional New West community. In addition, Sand to Snow Monument, another location that will not be reduced, is in San Bernardino County, which also lies in a Democratic voting atmosphere. In contrast, the three monuments that have been officially recommended for reductions in size all reside in historically red counties. Cascade Siskiyou is of particular interest, as it lies on the border of two historically blue states, but in red counties. The two counties that this monument is located in, Jackson County in southern Oregon and Siskiyou County in California, were red in the last two presidential elections. It would be too bold to say that there is a causation between the historical political atmosphere of one's county and the success of a national monument. However, it can't be denied that the correlation is thought-provoking. Lastly, it is important to address how protected lands have affected the economies of communities near them. As addressed, the West has by far the highest concentration of public lands in the continental U.S. The recreation that comes along with these lands has forced the shift from Old West to New West in many communities, driving up populations, incomes, and job needs. However, these new jobs are not typically Old West jobs, but rather jobs centered around services and tourism. These graphs from Headwater Economics show the economic trends in the West in the last decades. As you can see, employment, population, and personal income growth in the West is far outscoring non-Western regions of the country. In addition, jobs in healthcare and the service industry are booming in these areas, where many jobs in the extractive industry are declining. Headwaters Economics attributes this to the presence of protected public lands and the Old to New West shift. These statistics can seem abstract when context isn't given to them, so let's again set our focus on Utah. Protected public lands bring in a substantial amount of income and jobs to this state. In 2016 alone, there were over 14 million visitors at the Utah protected areas, resulting in well over 15,000 jobs and over $444 million in income for those Utah residents. In examining these real-world results, it is easy to see how the New West shift is changing the economy of Western states. So how can this information help us answer some of those research questions from the beginning? Is the degree of protection of public lands effective at preserving wilderness? We know from David Theobald's research and pairing his results with information from the Protected Areas database that more protection does in fact lead to less human modification. Does the political climate of an area play a role in the success rate of national monuments and the likelihood of revoking of status? Although there is not a definite causation, it may be wise for officials to take the political climate of a region into mind when establishing monuments. The culture and political history of an area may affect how a monument is received. Still, as discussed, there is opportunities for Old and New West cultures and mindsets to team up and fight for protected lands. What are the cultural and economic implications of living near protected lands? It's obvious that the West is experiencing a shift, both culturally and economically. This means certain traditions and industries in the area may become less viable in the future. However, new opportunities for growth seem promising.